everyone, and welcome to our Mindful Practices Town Hall, Equity and Allyship. I'm Erica. I'm an SEL specialist with Mindful Practices, and before I introduce our very special guests, we're going to arrive in the space by taking a centering breath together. So go ahead and place both feet on the floor. I'm going to invite you to roll your shoulders back and either close your eyes or look down at a 45-degree angle, whatever feels most accessible to you. And we're going to bring our awareness to our breath, taking a nice deep breath in through our nose and out through our mouth. One more deep breath in through our nose and out through our mouth. I'm just taking a quick moment to check in with where you're at this morning. How are you feeling emotionally? How's your body feeling? What are you bringing into this space? One more deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. If your eyes are closed, go ahead and gently flutter them open. Roll your shoulders back. Always the invitation to take any kind of stretching that your body needs. All right, wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and bring on our very special guests. Hi. So I am so honored to welcome Bryanna Wallace and Autumn Gupta to our Mindful Practices Town Hall on Equity and Allyship. They're going to tell you more about their journey in creating Justice in June, an online resource they co-created for individuals seeking to become better allies against systemic racial inequality. Welcome. Welcome.
Thank you. We're so excited to be here.
We're so glad to have you here. So I'm just going to jump right in. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourselves and how the two of you met?
Yes. So hi, everyone. I'm Bryanna. I am super pumped to just dive in and share with you guys today. Autumn and I met in 2015 as freshmen at USC. We were randomly assigned roommates. I was raised in Orange County, so it was just suburban area, and I, wanted to get a little bit farther away, but not too far in going to LA for school. I studied business administration with a dance minor and entrepreneurship emphasis, and I graduated last year, so I was class of 2019.
All right, so I'm going to jump into our kind of first question. So what is Justice in June, and how did this movement begin?
Yeah, I mean, it all started with a conversation. So when there was the murder of George Floyd, it was a catalyst to what we're seeing happening just in our communities and our societies right now. But it was also a shift for me. There was a series of closely, intertwined events between Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Christian Cooper and then George Floyd. And this one felt different. And it hit a little bit heavier. And I had shared on my social media a video, which is a space that I don't typically use to speak out about certain things, as I'd rather have those conversations critically and in person. But I felt the need for people to see a tangible reason and tangible person that is affected by what's going on. And whether people are following me because they love me, they admire me, they care for me, they respect me, here's someone you know, and this is how it's affecting my life. And so at the time, Autumn did not have Instagram. And so I had shared it with my parents, and then I shared it with her, and she saw it and she was like, wow, like there's a lot to unpack here. Can we just have a call and just focus on this? But also, how can I be there for you as a friend? And so we ended up talking 2.5 hours, a lot of talking on my part, listening on Autumn's, and that led to the next series of steps that, started Justice in June.
Yeah, and just to speak to that a little bit more, so specifically in this video, and I didn't have an Instagram, so Bri just texted me her posts, which I always appreciate and would love them. But in the very end of it, she poses this question to the viewer, and it's the idea of, if I was the one who was killed, what would you be doing right now? Would you be staying silent on social media? Would you be not using your voice or lending your voice. And for me, hearing that, I was like, this is my best friend. My life would be forever altered if that happened. And so I just felt a greater sense of conviction that there was more I could do. And I didn't want to necessarily just really like kind of cop out of, oh, you know what, I'm doing enough, or I'm educated enough, or even I'm a fellow person of color. It's not my job. And so that was really kind of a moment for me of like, oh, I had this realization. And so then I did say, Bree, we need to talk more in depth. I want to hear kind of just more of what you're feeling and where you're at, because I want to at least be able to say, I'm with you. I'm going to try to bear some of that burden. And so after that conversation, because I like to maybe sometimes too quickly jump to solution oriented of like, okay, what am I doing now? I just am very type A. I knew that I didn't really know most of the resources that were circulating at the time. And then it really was just, okay, June is a new month. Why don't I just dedicate this month to being really intentional with my learning and my own foundational piece of education? And so that's kind of where that structure came for having a 30-day plan where you could do 10 minutes, 25 minutes, 45 minutes, and start digging into some of those resources that were circulating just to understand as a step one, and then ideally start moving us towards informed change and informed decisions and actions that are helping to improve the condition for the Black community in the US.
Great, thank you. So would you mind walking us through this resource, Justice in June, and how to utilize it to be an anti-racist or an ally?
Perfect. Okay, so this is kind of we do have a website now. So we started out as a Google Doc, did not expect to get the traction that happened, thought that this would really just be something we shared with our friends and within our circle. And then people really resonated. So this is kind of an image from our homepage on the website. And again, just going back to here at the bottom, you can kind of see the 10 minutes, 25 minutes, 45 minutes. And part of that reasoning was we didn't want people to necessarily have an excuse of, oh, I don't have time, because I think we could all prioritize our days to have at least 10 minutes or even over a lunch break. And then also kind of that idea of, if you can binge watch Netflix, which most of us did over the quarantine period, then you at least have a similar amount of time to invest in just learning about a topic that desperately needs to have education and awareness brought to it. And so then if you go ahead and go to that next slide, this is a little bit of a specific view on one of those time breakouts. And so you can see that there's a setup that's daily, and it recommends a resource to look at for that day. And it roughly fits that 10-minute, 45-minute, or 25-minute time period. And so there's a mix of podcasts. And Erica, you go to the next slide. I think we'll show it. Oh, and then another view of it too is by week. So you get a daily view, which is kind of that calendar. You get a weekly view. And then if you go one more slide, and then yes, you can kind of just access the resources as you want with things you can watch. We have videos, there's things you can read. So again, it's like article pieces, and then actions you can take, as well as things you can listen to, because we wanted to include a variety of media and ways that you could consume them, since everyone is a slightly different learner. Yeah, so that's just kind of a quick overview of what the Google Doc was, and then how it kind of got translated onto our website.
Great, thank you. Okay, you're back, Bryanna. Yay. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So what has the response been like to Justice in June so far?
It has been amazing. We are just really humbled and grateful and appreciative of the amount of support that we've gotten. In just a week alone, our doc had reached almost 200,000 people who had accessed it. And our GoFundMe, which we ended up starting because everyone was like, how can we pay you? And we were like, we don't want compensation, but we see this need, so let's work towards a website. And we set a goal of 1,000, and within 10 days it had hit and overshot 10K. And now we're at almost 17K. And I think that those pieces are just a testament to the fact that this was so needed. And a lot of people were reaching out because they felt like they were so overwhelmed. They were getting all of this information, and all these resources, 20 different books to read, and they just needed a starting place. They just needed it to be framed in a way where it shows this is bite-sized, this is doable, and literally in as little as 10 minutes, you can now go and shift your behavior and change those habits.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and then just to tag on to that, the other thing that we've been really impressed by is how it does seem that individuals do feel more agency or feel a little higher efficacy in their ability to be part of this solution. Because I think it's really easy if you look back politically to say, oh, well, my vote doesn't matter, or this doesn't matter because I am only one person. But Bree and I have been so impressed by just people who felt the need to even reach out and say, thank you so much because I wasn't able to participate in this conversation in X, Y, and Z way. And now I realize I do have a role to play, and that they've been able to use Justice in June even just as that step one of I'm going to start learning, and I'll be able to at least question or push back against one relative's perhaps more outdated viewpoint. And that conversation is planting seeds, and again, it's progressing us over time to a more lasting change. So that's been really cool on that end, is not only that the financial support and the talent of people who've reached out and said, hey, we can help get you to this next level, but then also just seeing individuals feel empowered to actively use their voice and be part of this change.
Yeah, it's amazing. So as you know, our audience is primarily educators. So we're going to shift a little bit and speak to education. So how do we as educators set the new expectations and create safe spaces in our role as mentors, but also as folks who hold a position of power in classrooms and in schools, and particularly when you are a white educator working with students of color? Kind of two parts to that question, I guess. Oh, you're muted, Bryanna.
Thank you. Just in general, when you come from a place of semi-authority, right, but also that mentorship guidance role, it's really important to recognize what are those needs as best you can, obviously, for the individuals that you're influencing, and recognizing that people who might come from a marginalized or more oppressed community may not have the same reinforcement outside of the interaction they're getting with that person that helps them to stay on that same playing field. And to the best of your ability, if you're able to equalize it, right, that is what's going to be helpful to the youth and young minds, because you might have one who the same intelligence level, right? Same interaction and drive, but maybe at home, their parents are really driving, whatever they need to get done, checking in, having those calls. And the other one may not have those resources, right? Or we don't know what other life stresses are happening that doesn't allow for that same reinforcement. And so taking that into account, and also just looking at, is there representation, right? In the media, the books, the materials, right, the conversations that are being had across all spheres. There's a way to recognize, am what I teaching, right, and what I'm putting in front of these kids, does every single student or pupil feel like they see themselves in what we're discussing? And if they don't, what can I shift to make sure that I'm allowing that to take place?
Yeah, and this is something that is really relevant for me now, because I will be teaching 8th grade science this upcoming year. And especially knowing that all of our students have just come off of a period of extreme disruption on top of the social disruption that's quite frankly happening. And then perhaps going again into a virtual learning environment, I'm very cognizant of, okay, I want to be able to bring my best to my students. So I think for me, one thing that I really thought about is just acknowledging and not gaslighting or not invalidating anything that I'm hearing my students say. And one of my other really good friends, Julia Doherty, shout out to her, always preaches on your feelings are valid. So even if I can't understand or necessarily agree, like maybe I don't think they had X, Y, or Z experience, I cannot invalidate that, because for them that's very real. And so I think my biggest thing will be just lots of empathy and being open to recognizing that your experience is 100% valid, and I'm here to listen to it. I might not be able to do anything with that, but I will always promise that I can listen. And then in addition to that, I think it's really important that when you're in a position of authority, especially for younger kids, you role model what it's like to own up to your actions. So you can say, hey, maybe I didn't handle this situation the best way. Here's how I would have done it going forward, and here's how I will do it going forward. Or even just showing that accountability for what you're saying, what you're doing. I can remember back to specific teachers in my experience who were accountable for their actions, or who at least admitted they were wrong. And it's crazy to me that that's so mind-blowing, just to see someone admit when they were wrong and then correct it in the future, and how much more I respected that person, or was like, wow, that was actually really cool. And maybe we have this fear that that makes us look weak or vulnerable, but in reality, that just makes us stronger, and moving forward, you're going to have that trust built with your students then. And then I think finally too, Bree touched on this, is the representation piece, and knowing that within, like, across the US, there are pockets of just 99% are all looking one way. So you might have whatever that minority is then feeling just othered or isolated, and even more so having to be cognizant of that. Or at the same time, just bringing the same level of diversity or inclusion to the materials you're using, because there are Black scientists, there are Black authors, there are kids' books that show like the physical pictures show characters that look like you. And so, to speak from a personal experience I just had, there's a new Netflix show called Never Have I Ever, and it's the first show that I can remember in my lifetime that discusses any of the South Asian Indian experience in the US context. And hearing even some of the pet names and the words that the mom uses for the daughter, I was like, that's what my grandma says. My grandma says those exact words to me. And it was, I mean, it's silly. It's a focus on like a freshman teenage woman, so I can't necessarily relate to all of her experiences. But even seeing someone who looks like me and hearing words of like what my family uses was so impactful, and I just felt very emotional seeing that, because I didn't realize how much I missed that, and missed seeing someone that felt like I could immediately connect to. And so knowing that I just had that experience this year, and I'm 23 years old, I really want to be intentional with promoting that kind of content in my classroom, and then encouraging and keeping my fellow teachers accountable to that standard also. Even if the school is predominantly white or predominantly whatever race, I think it's still important to have the narratives of other people represented in the classroom.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I love how you're both speaking about this empathy building, this holding space, and really being able to see every child in the narrative of history, right? And anything that we're presenting in the classroom. It's so, so important. And we as educators have an opportunity to really re-examine what we're bringing into the classroom right now, and say, we need to redo this. We need to rethink this. This textbook that we've been using for the past however many years is not representative of our students or our culture, or, so thank you so much for sharing that. And just before we move on to our next question, for those of you who are with us, if you have any questions for Autumn or Bryanna, you can put them in the Q&A, and we will be addressing them at the end of our pre-planned questions, if you will. All right, great. So thank you for those beautiful answers, and I'll move on to the next question. So what do you two believe is the role of a white educator when it comes to anti-racist teaching and learning? So that's the first part of this question. And then, does being a white educator teaching other white folks about historic and systemic inequity maintain the system of white supremacy?
Yeah, I mean, just asking that question is important, right? And thinking about because I don't think it's something that has really had a dialogue or space around it. It's just been, this is the status quo. Are we even thinking about the teachers and educators that are in front of students? And does that matter? And I'll just root it in a personal experience. I remember seeing on Facebook once, someone ask, like across the board, not just any community, right? When was the first time you remember having a Black teacher, let alone a Black male teacher? And I remember going through the comments, and just the responses were like, never, one in college, one woman in high school, and then I just think about my experience, and all throughout high school, that was the case. It wasn't until college, and I never had a black male professor, right? And how detrimental is that to anyone on one side for young black men, especially, and women, though, not seeing someone reflected in who's teaching them, and then also in young white folks, right? And other minorities, because if you never interact with someone of a different community, your only notion is going to be what you see in media, right? Or what people tell you about a certain group. And a lot of that gets ingrained very young. So I think it's recognizing that, okay, you're in this space, right? And so how are you going to care for those students, those people receiving the education from you, and making sure that you are allowing for opportunities in those spaces to maybe bring in other voices, right? We see guest speakers, we see other field trips we have. Like, how is there another way to incorporate that? And on the second part of the question, unfortunately, that does, still lend itself to white supremacist systems and structures. It doesn't mean that someone who is a white educator has, racist beliefs or believes that, they are rightfully in that place and no one else should be. It just means that our systems and structures, which include education, benefit from white supremacist ideology. And so in the education system in general, I think that's an opportunity for educators to make their voice heard, and we need to diversify who's being brought to the table. When new teachers get hired on, when new substitute teachers are brought in, right? When department heads are assigned, when you have administration, how are you using your voice to say, okay, but we need people that don't just look like us, despite what the demographic of a school or an education entity is. I think that's the biggest point, is that it doesn't always have to be because you have minority students, so you need to have minority representation. White people need to be seeing it too, because we have people coming out of these cities and towns and maybe going to college and never having met a black person or never having met a Latinx person. And now they're like, I don't know how to handle this, or just that's where you get those microaggressions and those tone deaf, interactions.
Yeah, I could not reiterate more what Bryanna just discussed. But again, I think for myself, even what she just described was very true, because I grew up in a predominantly white town in rural Missouri. And so just by geographic distribution, I did not know other people of color growing up. I knew like literally the token Latinx and the token black student, and then my sister and I. And that was pretty much it. So then when I did move to a super diverse metropolitan area like Los Angeles, the only notions I had, even being from a family that really worked to give me more of a global perspective, or say like, hey, our bubble of the Midwest is different than what other people experience. Even with them working hard to expose me to other ideas, I defaulted to assumptions that were very prevalent in media, or very prevalent in kind of the discourse we have around certain stereotypes. And so Bryanna knows, she saw me freshman year just kind of like really grappling with a lot of racial and ethnic identity for myself, and then with who I was interacting with. And I think it was such a blessing for me that Bryanna and then one of my other best friends both represented two groups that I hadn't really interacted with. And then I immediately had this personal connection with someone who was like, okay, when I default to maybe a stereotype or a microaggression, instead of thinking of what's portrayed in media or what's kind of the societal norm, I could immediately think of Bryanna or this other friend. And for me, that just really helped. Oh, no, this is a holistic, dynamic, well-rounded person that's not at all what I used to believe they were, even subconsciously, like just absorbing that over the years and years that we're told these messages. So yeah. I think that is really important. It's not just for communities of color or for schools that have a few students. It is literally a conversation for everyone. And so that's probably like my biggest piece on that. And then knowing too, I think sometimes discussions that try to move us towards solutions don't take into account like how things change realistically or in reality what the pace of change looks like. And so I'd say it's really important in the education sector to think about what are the short-term changes I can make in my classroom in a month, especially now that we have newer opportunities with digital learning. There are ways that you can provide videos, provide voices, have professors, teachers of color call in. And again, I feel a little conflicted on this because it's not the job of the Black community to educate us. But if they've stepped into this role, or if those specific people have advertised like, yes, I like this role and I want to speak from this place of informed experience, then by all means, we should take advantage of them graciously stepping into that space. But I think that there's new opportunities for short-term changes to bring more of that representation in the classroom, because we have a very different model of school going forward. And then I think though that there needs to be subsequent conversations like long-term, how are we reaching schools that produce teachers of color, and that how do we get those people into our pipeline so that our school is able to benefit from them, not just, oh, we've only tagged, the 3 colleges in our city. I feel like there's more opportunity to think, yes, we have this initiative, or we're going to give lip service to a goal we have to be a part of the change. But then what are those smaller, tangible action steps that will lead you to that change? And that's where I'm more hesitant, or maybe slightly less optimistic, because it's very easy to then kind of slip back into our default of, oh, well, we're doing our due diligence, or we're doing this and this and this, or we have these 5 goals for 2020 and then 2021. But I think there needs to be a more pressure or more intention behind creating those opportunities in the first place.
Yes, and I think, kind of to both of your points, the more opportunity we have to see people of color in teaching positions, the more young students will be inspired to become teachers, right? So we're actually like building a system that is currently very broken. And like you said, there's, predominantly white right now and female dominated the education or the teaching field. So this is actually a great segue to our next question, which has to do with compassion fatigue. And you kind of mentioned this, Autumn, when you said, you have like 5 things that you do this year and then 5 things that you do the next year, like getting burnt out, right? Compassion fatigue. So the question is, how do we address compassion fatigue when it comes to our learning journey to be an active anti-racist? Yeah. And we had talked about maybe, having a conversation about what compassion fatigue was. I'll bring Erin on, maybe if she wants to come on. Erin's in the background, answering questions and facilitating the chat. Hi, Erin. This is Erin.
You all are doing such a wonderful job, just like dropping wisdom. I love it.
Thank you. So we'll actually start with you all if you want to. So how would we address, or would you like me to talk about what compassion fatigue is a little bit? Maybe would that be helpful to start? All right, so compassion fatigue and teacher burnout and secondary trauma are very real. And a lot of the times we'll say, oh, teachers, educators have the summers off, they have a break. But what we're dealing with in the classroom is not only the trauma from our own lives, but the trauma of our students is actually impacting our nervous system and how our brain is wired. So I'm going to do a little example. Autumn and I were talking about this before the phone call, of Dan Siegel's hand model to kind of illustrate what stress can do to the brain and body. So I'll do this. Feel free to do this with me if you want, if you're at home or you all want to do that. So if you take your hand like this and you fold your thumb in, bringing your fingers over, this is actually a really great model of the brain. So imagine that the eyes are here, the head and neck is right here. And if I lift my fingers up, I have the spinal cord, the brain stem, and the limbic area. And all of these working together are what we might call the downstairs brain. So this is where fight or flight happens, where our emotions live. And then if we fold our fingers over, this top part is called our neocortex, or our cortex. And this part of our brain is responsible for higher thinking. So reasoning, it's also responsible for movement of the body sometimes. And then if you move right here to these fingernails, this is the prefrontal cortex, which is actually the place that integrates everything. So it's the place where we are able to take a pause, to take a breath. If anyone says like, take a breath, relax, like this is the part of the brain that's activated and hears that. It's the part of the brain that builds empathy and compassion. So it's incredibly important. And what happens when we have a stress reaction or we have a trauma reaction is we do something called flipping our lid. We lose access to our rational brain and we are being driven by our downstairs brain. I like to use the example, and there are so many examples of this right now, but to use an example of something that happens in my life, when I drive in the car, someone cuts me off and I start screaming. I flip my lid. It's not a rational response. That person cannot hear me. It's just me releasing stress hormones into my system. And when we spend a lot of time in the downstairs brain reacting, right? Reacting to the things that we see, it wreaks havoc on our brains and our bodies. It can be linked, stress, it can be a really good thing. Jump out of the way, or, there are so many reasons why we need that fight or flight thing happening in our brain. But the thing that we are really finding in educators is that we're going into fight, flight, freeze, or fold, which has to do with dissociation and dysregulation that you were speaking to earlier, Bryanna and Autumn. When we continually go through that, it changes our brain and the way that we associate with our students. And that's when we start to see this compassion fatigue, this burnout. It physically takes a toll on us, and it's very real. So that's kind of a little 101 on compassion fatigue, secondary trauma. That's the very tip of the iceberg. And there are so many resources out there for people who are more interested in learning about compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. But I'll just say that, lay the groundwork for what that is, and then return to this question. So how do we address compassion fatigue when it comes to our learning journey to be an active anti-racist? So this like exhaustion in the brain and body, how do we continue to re-engage in these important conversations?
Right. It starts with recognizing that, one, this is not a perfect process, right? This is not a comfortable process. This is not a joyful process all the time. And when you can recognize, okay, I'm going to go through this, it might be challenging, it might be hard, I might have to have those tough conversations with people, I might have to do some internal unlearning, and there's some people that are coming to recognize, wow, I've contributed to some negative, prejudiced environments. That's a lot to take in and handle, but it's important because it is literally at the expense of lives. And so I saw something that said it's a privilege to get to learn about racism and rather than experience it. So you have to do the work, but recognize that we can all be in different lanes on the same road, headed toward the same goal and destination. So for some people, that means showing up to the protests. For others, that means doing the education piece so that they can have more impactful, fruitful conversations. For some people, that means donating, right? For others, it means getting involved with community organizations, right? And leading in that sphere. And so each and every one of those lanes is valid, is purposeful, and it might take you some time to figure out what that is for you, but you don't have to fall also into the comparison trap of everyone's posting on social media, right? Everyone's saying which organization they donated to and which conversation they had. That's what everyone else can do, but figure out what that piece is for you. And then also realize that you have to give yourself grace. You have to know when you're hitting a brick wall with someone and that is draining your energy. And also that every conversation doesn't have to be the turning point conversation. It can be sowing the seeds. It can be planting the ideas or challenging just a little bit of a perspective and then stepping away. And whether it's a future conversation with yourself or with someone else who comes along and starts to churn that shift in idea, that's just as valuable. And knowing when to say, I need to step back and I don't need to pull away from what's going on as a movement, but maybe need to redirect my energy in a different way until I feel that I'm in a better headspace to continue pushing this on. And when you find that lane that you want to be in, it will rejuvenate you, even if it's tiring. For us, Autumn and I, this is our way of pouring into this movement. In the beginning especially, I did not feel safe or comfortable going to a protest. I did not feel that if something were to happen, that my life would be recognized or my safety would be prioritized by the people around me and the authorities that were in place. And so this was a way to contribute to this conversation that, while it may be exhausting, right, while it may be, stepping into a place of vulnerability and transparency, I know that something's moving because of what I'm doing and how I'm using my voice, and encouraging others to tap into that as well.
Yeah, if anything, I would just say, in addition to that, is you can do those things for yourself, but also help your friends, your family do those things for them. Because like Bree and I had that call, and that was us both stepping into a place of, we're going to lean on each other. You're not doing this alone. You're never doing anything in life entirely by yourself. And I know my brain has told myself that kind of lie. There's been definitely periods of my life where I'm like, I'm so alone and no one is here with me. No one's doing this with me. But in the reality is we're really never alone. And I think encouraging others, like Bree said, to find that lane, find that place of, the challenge is just enough to be met by your talents. And then it's so rewarding. You get into that flow of, I am doing something meaningful, and it is having an impact. And if anything, several people that have reached out to us after different Instagram lives we've done have said, I don't know what to do because I'm pouring 100% of myself into every single conversation. And they're just like, I'm exhausted. I can't keep doing that. And exactly like Bree pointed out, the first thing everyone can do is just have conversations. I don't think it's that challenging to ask you to just be cognizant of, hey, if something comes up, or if you have the ability just to say a little piece, you should, because we all are talking pretty frequently, and especially now with social media. But with that, it's knowing that audience. So if you do feel a lot of resistance, it's not that you shouldn't have the conversation, but you maybe should be more aware of how much of yourself you give to that conversation. And at the end of the day, you're still planting a seed. And we're hoping too that people can kind of step into this space with less of a cancel culture attitude and more of the people who we maybe would be like, oh, you're canceled, we're done, are the ones who need to hear this the most. And so even if you plant that seed, but do it in a way where you're less focused on that guilt and shame and more focused on, hey, recognition, acknowledgement, and forward progress, who knows when in the future they're going to think about that again and then say, hey, this person didn't make me feel horrible, is still someone I can contact. They may follow up with you because you're allowing yourself to be approachable, be accessible. And I think that's the huge win. That's what we want to get to, is that subsequent follow-up conversation beyond the initial seed planting. It's like, when are you helping to nourish that and grow that? And it might not be you. I think we all have to be more comfortable with not necessarily getting the recognition or the acknowledgement, but knowing that we're still putting that energy out there and putting those ideas out there. And maybe somebody else down the line is the one that gets to see that come to fruition. But at the end of the day, it's still, I think everyone can have conversations to help progress it. And then it is, like Bree said, just really figuring out what works for you, using your talents, using your energy, and maybe just your season of life. Like maybe, like right now, I just finished being a student and I'm about to become a teacher. So financially, I don't have a ton of purchasing power to contribute to the movement in that way. But I am in the education space. And so this is the lane that I am most able to use and most rewarded by using, because it is something that just feels good for the talents that I have.
Thank you both for sharing that. And Holland, I think that you did a wonderful job actually explaining what compassion fatigue is, so I'll take a back seat to that. But I really appreciate 2 points that you both brought up. One point, thinking about not focusing so much on the guilt and shame you might be feeling, especially as a white person. But also, Bryanna, you mentioned thinking about the aspect of privilege. So white folks have the privilege to be exhausted or feel compassion fatigue about this work, and then be able to take a step back. That is not something that is a privilege for Black folks, Indigenous, or people of color. And that is just something that is on my mind right now. I hope other white educators think about that as they are continuing their education or activism journey. And the other thing that I want to mention too is thinking about, as we are progressing into the school year, racism is trauma. So if you are working with students of color, keeping in mind that if we want to throw it back to ACEs, and please watch Dr. Nadine Burke's TED Talk on that. ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Race or racism is a trauma, and you can consider that to be one. And then we also have COVID, which is a trauma as well. So everyone really is going into the school year who's a student of color with 2 ACEs. So keeping that in mind as educators, I think, is absolutely critical, and also focusing for yourself on self-awareness and self-regulation when you are in the classroom. Holland, the way you put it, when we lose access to our rational brain, that happened a lot when I was a teacher. I was a teacher for 10 years before this. But also making sure that you are self-aware and self-regulating in your anti-racist journey is absolutely critical too. So thank you both for that. I'll be back for Q&A.
Before we come back, we move on to our next question, I just wanted to lift up one other thing that you said, Autumn, about, I believe it was Autumn, although maybe Bryanna, you said it as well, about like acknowledging that you made a mistake in front of your students.
Yes.
That's very powerful, that don't be afraid to engage in these conversations, right? And is what I'm hearing you say, and make mistakes and then acknowledge those mistakes and change moving forward, because no one is perfect, like you said. And so I thought that was really powerful. That really resonated with me. I just wanted to say that one more, reiterate that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. So what is the most impactful resource that you've come across in building the Justice in June curriculum? It's probably hard to choose one, but maybe top 3, if that's easier.
Yes, I think this question differs for me based on so I know for myself which ones have been most impactful, but it's been more interesting to me to see the people who are engaging, like what's really resonating with them. And I think one of the best, like if I could only recommend one for generally speaking for the white folks who are starting this conversation, it's really watching some of the stuff from Peggy McIntosh on unpacking what white privilege is, or just unpacking kind of preconceived notions you might bring to the table to even enter into this space. And I've seen a lot of friends say that was really helpful for me because of the way she framed certain issues. And I think kind of hand in hand with that is any of the work that Jane Elliott has done has really resonated with people on their day 1 or week 1 of trying to enter the conversation. For me, already being within a community of color, something that's actually been really hard for Bryanna and I is to figure out what are the first questions people have, because we are we're so ingrained already in this conversation that I don't even think to ask what some of my friends are asking. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that's where the starting place was. So we're both trying to identify that better. But then for me, something I think I'm more open or ready to read from Black activists and Black scholars who really do write honestly and so well on this is what they're identifying, experiencing, and these are the ways that you can start improving from that. So Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, that's been one of my favorites. He's just phenomenal speaker, just presents things in such an, in my opinion, such an understandable way where it isn't guilting or shaming you, but it's saying like, hey, this is what is, and then this is what could be, and here's the role that you can play. So I think for me that his book and then any of his talks, any of his speaking engagements have been my favorite and have resonated most with me because they are so actionable. And I like to have steps that I can take towards the solution instead of just, discussing things at a very theoretical, academic, Socratic sort of level. Bree, I don't know if you had feedback from friends, because this isn't necessarily something you've had to learn.
My life is a great resource. So I would say, actually, just on a serious note, I think for some people, for me, just stepping into that place of being transparent and telling others that, one, like we've reiterated, right, it's not the job of the Black community to educate. It's not their responsibility to tell you how or what to do to be better. But I know that I would be doing a disservice if I didn't lend my voice to what's going on. And I think for some people, even I've seen within my workspace, saying, hey, when you have questions, right, or if you're struggling or you're silent because X, Y, or Z, let's break that down and talk about it. And I'm not going to come from a place of judgment or telling you that you're doing it wrong. I want to help you process through how you can amplify what's going on, and how, like, something that Autumn and I have said is, like, we need to make this conversation as easy to talk about as the weather and coronavirus. That's the point we need to get to. And it takes people stepping to that space of saying, I want to ask a question so that I can get honest feedback, right? And not just shy away from asking it because I might be labeled as something, because that's a reflection of ego and pride, as opposed to wanting to learn because you want to better yourself and better this movement that's taking place.
Yes, thank you for that. And our brains are changing all the way up throughout our entire life. So there is always an opportunity to learn and to engage in those conversations. So thank you so much for that. So we only have a few minutes left, but I do want, before we open it up, if we have time for that, I do want to ask you to speak about Justice in July and what's next for Justice in June. I have a couple of slides that I can share. Will you just let me know when you want me to pop those up?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, so Justice in July, like we said, we didn't expect this to blow up in the way it did, but as we saw people committing to, putting in that time, we committed to continuing to build out new resources and tools. And so we are working towards a version 2.0 of our site, which I'll let Autumn elaborate on. But because website development takes a while and what we want to do with it is very in depth, we had the awesome opportunity to work with an app called Snap Habit and them to help us create essentially our version of Justice in July. And so on the slides, you'll be able to see Justice in July essentially does a weekly format where it's more modular and themed. So you can do each week individually, but they work cohesively together. And the content seeks to answer a question every week. So for example, the first week, is racism still a problem in 21st century America, right? So that's laying the foundation. And you have these pieces, and now we also have these to think, right? These thought starters. And what's great about this is, one, it's 1 week, right? You can see your progress, which for some people need that gratification of like, oh, yes, I checked it off. Not in the sense of like I'm checking a box, but like I've now completed, I'm ready to go into the next thing. And then also bringing people along with you. So you can do a solo habit, like each of these are set as routines. You can do a solo habit, or you can do a group habit. And now it'll prompt you, and you can invite someone to download it and take you right to it. And you can interact with the content and material together. You can put your notes, someone can respond to that. And it just allows you to step into that space of conversation, and maybe also a great way to bring someone on board. Maybe you have a friend that doesn't know where to start, or you're like, they really need to learn. Hey, do this 1 week breakdown with me and let's talk about it. And that's a baby step, and it's taking it and allowing us to learn from what our users are drawn to. And this is a slightly different format than Justice in June, so that we can see how we can shift our approach for our final version that will really kind of take it to a more experienced and tailored learning plan.
Yeah, and then thanks, Eric. I think we're good on the screen sharing if you want. But yeah, just to speak a little bit more towards, so then the next steps for Justice in June is, Bree just said, is that version 2 of our website. And again, we really want to meet people where they're at. So everything we're doing is centered around how do we make this experience better, more impactful, and then ideally both of those things lend itself to being a longer term change. And so ideally what we're envisioning is that when you come to our site, you'll do some sort of intake survey where we can kind of figure out like maybe where your political ideology is. How old are you? What kind of materials do you like to learn, whether it's video or podcast or article? How much time do you have? And then most importantly, what are you there to learn? So are you brand new to the conversation and you really you just don't know where to start. So you need, again, that first stepping stone. Or you perhaps very well versed in the overarching themes and you want to dive deeply into mass incarceration or the school to prison pipeline, one of those more specific nuanced topics that has a lot of material just within it. And so after you do this brief survey or questionnaire, then on the back end, we have a database with all of these different resources that have been circulated and that have been produced discussing these different issues. And our algorithm will be able to create a tailored learning plan. So maybe you're Sean, you're brand new to the conversation, you've never thought about white privilege or using your voice, and you only have 3 weeks off of a certain job, and you have like a 3-week period. So for 20 minutes every day, we would be able to send you video content because that's what you want to consume. And it's purely around how do you enter the conversation, defining some of those terms, and accessible resources for you. Because ideally, we want everyone who has then that tailored learning plan to have such a good experience with it that they either can share our website with others to bring them along, and or they're encouraged to keep learning, because ultimately we want to keep nudging people towards this lifestyle change, this different perspective, different mindset, because that's what's going to get us to that more permanent society-wide change.
And I will say just really quickly, because we do want to get to questions, is we're also in tandem with that working on a professional framework. So if anyone is watching, tuning in, right, and you have a company or part of a brand, a business, we understand that diversity and inclusion trainings as they exist now, either one, don't exist in certain companies that don't have a built out HR department or whatever it is, or they're just not doing the job as they should be, and they're just another assessment, another box to check off. And so we're building out a professional framework that takes into account the pieces that are successful with Justice in June and brings that and adapts that for the workplace setting.
So amazing. So amazing. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to be respectful of your time. But Erin, did we have a question pop up that you wanted to share?
Yeah, a couple questions. Maybe we can do like a 1-minute answer. That will be my challenge to both of you.
Really quick.
Yeah, it's a game show now, okay? But first, I do want to thank you both for your intellectual and also emotional labor in creating Justice in June and Justice in July, and these ongoing projects that are popping up. I'm so excited about the idea of the professional framework. I think it would be great for schools to be able to use too, to think about that avenue. 2 questions really quickly that did pop up, and I'm so sorry, everyone, that's all we have time for. The first question, with a very short answer, please. If I don't typically use social media, is posting now about racism, protest, violence against the Black community performative?
I would say, I'm going to make this really quick, it's very nuanced. And this is something I assess when I'm looking at my friends, if I usually don't see you posting on social media, and your last post was from December 2019, I'm not going to expect to see anything from you on your social media. And it goes back to the idea of lanes, right? If that's just not your sphere in general, don't feel that pressure to now post a whole bunch of stuff, because to people like me who are part of these communities or have maybe been alongside this fight, it is going to look performative. But if you want to come on and honestly share a post of, I'm not on here usually, but this is what I've been doing in the background, that might inspire someone. That's more intentional than now having this flooded story, of all these different carousels of new words and ideas. And instead, maybe share the resources that you've been going into and what that process has been looking like.
Thank you so much. And then the last one we have time for, how can I start a conversation with someone who is not interested in DEI? And in case you are not familiar with DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are a couple parts of it, actually. It often feels like wasted breath on deaf ears. So do you have any advice for having critical conversations with folks you know in a way that is inviting or not making them feel bad? So not shaming.
Yeah. Figure out why they are at the stance or belief they do. You ask questions. People love to talk, right? So there's a way that we talked about with one of our friends that is helping us to work on this. And he was like, I don't know what to do for those people that just don't get it. And we talked through that and said, if someone says, oh, but what about, let's use just cops, because that's easy to delineate, right? And they're like, but it's just a few bad apples and there are good cops. And then ask them, okay, so you think there aren't bad cops, right? And see what that response is, and then work it back, right? So do you think that police brutality doesn't exist? Get to the root of why they believe what they do. Is it because they were raised in a family that didn't value diverse mindsets, right? Or only showed and fed into what those stereotypes was? Was it because they never interacted with someone of a diverse background to begin with? Or, what is the root of the experience? And that will better inform you on how you need to approach that topic. And then also, don't waste your breath if it is wasted breath. It's like we said, not every conversation is always going to be fruitful in that way. But if you're just sowing the seeds, sow the seeds, and don't let them take from you that energy and that drive to push this forward.
Thank you both so much. Really appreciate having you here with us today. And Holland, I'll pass it over to you for our community breath.
Yeah, so again, just as Erin said, we are so grateful and honored that you shared space with us today. And Erin has dropped all information about Justice in June in the chat, but please visit their website, consider donating to this incredible resource. Thank you so much. I'm just overwhelmed and inspired by everything that you both have done and are doing amidst having a full-time job, Bryanna, and Autumn transitioning into being a teacher for the first time. I mean, it's overwhelming. And those 8th graders are very lucky, Autumn.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For having us and amplifying this conversation. And you can reach us at justiceinjuneofficial@gmail.com. We are active on our social medias and engaging in conversations like these. And every week we break down some hot topic with our hot takes with Autumn and Bree. So if that's something you're interested in, we take questions, we take comments, but we want this to be an active dialogue. We want to make sure that people feel like they're involved in this conversation. So thank you all for lifting this up and bringing light and bringing awareness and putting in the work as well.
Yes.
And if you are watching a recording, please feel free to share this with anyone and everyone. So thank you. If you want, you can stay with me on camera, or you can turn your camera off and I'll close out the time with the community breath, whatever feels great to you.